All right, welcome back. So in the last lesson, we got our basic application up and running, and we created a simple HTML page, and we were able to serve up that page to our web browser to display the words "Hello World." So now we're going to take a deeper dive into how this is basically working. I'm going to try not to go too deeply though, because a lot of that depth isn't probably going to be necessary for you to be able to just build something useful. But I want you to have some amount of mental model about how this is all working, okay? So let's start with just looking at how the browser actually got the words "Hello World" on the screen, okay? So we typed in the words localhost 8080, and then we hit enter, and then we got these words here. So what actually happened when we did this? So first off, let's talk about this term localhost and understand what that even means. You're probably used to being able to type in something like CNN.com or www.cnn.com or youtube.com or whatever. Those names that you normally will type into a browser conceptually refer to a computer or a server on the internet somewhere. Every time your browser tries to retrieve data from some place to show you a page or whatever, in effect, your browser is really just requesting data from a computer somewhere on the internet. And that computer will have a name, essentially. Okay. Now, there can be a lot more complexity to it than that, but basically every computer on the internet has a name. Actually, every computer on the internet has a numerical address, but those addresses typically can be translated into names for the most part. Now, a lot of computers have one default name that can be used to refer to themselves, and that name is localhost. They also have a numerical address that can additionally be used, and I'll even show you what that looks like. You can usually type in 127.0.0.1 8080, and if I do this, yeah, so that works as well. So that is kind of like an alias numerical address for the computer that I'm running on right now to refer to itself, 127.0.0.1. Now, pretty much every computer can refer to itself with this address, 127.0.0.1, which, by the way, is called a loopback address if you really wanted to know, because it's only useful for programs that are trying to connect to the computer that they themselves are running on, okay? So if you have a program running on your computer, like a web browser, and you have a web server running on the same computer, and you want your browser to be able to access data from the web server, you could refer to the web server at the address 127.0.0.1, and that will let the browser refer back to itself, okay? But another computer would not be able to access data on your computer with the address 127.0.0.1. 127.0.0.1 only refers to the current computer that address is being requested from, okay? In terms of Java, you can think of 127.0.0.1 as being the this operator. You can think of it as the keyword this, okay? It refers to the computer that your code is running on, essentially, okay? Sorry if that's a little confusing, but all right. So anyway, and then the 127.0.0.1 address has an alias, if you will, which is localhost, okay? So those two terms are synonymous with each other, localhost or 127.0.0.1. Okay, now the next part that we had to do, though, was we had to type in a :8080. So what is that? So let me give you a little simple, very simple depiction to help you understand what that is. Okay, so here we have a very simple depiction of a house. I want you to imagine that your computer is this house, okay? And this house has windows and doors. And a generic English term that we could use to refer to the doors and the windows of a house is port. Okay, so a house has ports, which are really just holes in walls. You know, a door is a hole in a wall. Windows are holes in walls. Okay, so those are ports, more generically speaking. Okay, so a house can have ports. Likewise, a computer can also have ports. So let us imagine that this house or computer has these ports and that these ports can be labeled with numbers. So as you see here, I have labeled some of these ports or windows and doors with numbers like 9090 or 80 or 8080, okay? These numbers can be arbitrary, by the way. So I could have numbered this window 1024 or 10 or whatever I wanted to, pretty much. Though there is an upper limit that I do not recall at the moment. The purpose of these ports is so that any data that tries to come into this house can specify which port it wants to come to. So let us imagine that the person who is sitting at this window at port 8080 provides a service of saying hello world to anyone who will come up to this window and greet him. Okay, that's what he does. He says hello world in English. Okay, and maybe this person over here provides a service of saying hello world in Japanese. Okay, that's what he does. And then this person in the middle provides the same service, but in whatever, some other language. Okay, so that's what these people do. So they sit here and they wait for a request to come to them, and that request will come to them because the request will state which port it's for. So back over here, when we typed in localhost :8080, what we were doing was we were specifying a port on the local computer, 8080, and what will happen is there should be a program running that is listening on that port. So we can think of this guy here as the program that we started up. And he is configured to listen specifically to port 8080, okay? So we could have other programs that are listening on other ports simultaneously, okay? So you could think of this as having 3 programs that are all listening on each of these ports simultaneously. Okay, so we're simply stating what port we want. Now, some of you may be thinking, that's kind of weird because when I go to CNN.com or YouTube.com, I don't have to specify :8080 or any other port. It just works. Why is that? And you are right, that is correct. The reason that just works is because web browsers have all agreed that if you do not explicitly specify a port, there will be a default port assumed, and that default port is port 80, okay? Port 80. So if you don't say in a browser what port you're trying to request data from, the browser will just tack on port 80 and send your request to that port at whatever server or computer you are addressing, okay? But you can specify explicitly other ports. Now, if there isn't a program listening on that port, then you'll get back nothing, right? It'll just be an error. So just because you can think of a port doesn't mean you'll get any data for that port. There has to be a program listening, just as there has to be a person sitting at that window, so to speak. So whatever you type in here is a URL, and that stands for Uniform Resource Locator, okay? So it's just a standard way to specify what data you're trying to retrieve from within your browser, okay? So when we type in a URL in the browser and we hit return, the browser generates what you can think of essentially as a text document. Usually it'll be a very short text document, and that document essentially boils down to requesting that another document be sent back to the browser to display, okay? So in our case here, we made a request to retrieve a document, and this is what we got back, this hello world. I want to show you a little more though of what's in this request and then the response from the server, okay? So there are a couple ways that we can actually look at this. First off, now I'm currently in Safari, but in a minute here, I'm going to switch over to Chrome. But if I use Safari, I can open up some developer tools with a Command Option I. And obviously Safari, I think, only exists on Mac, but no worries. I mean, if you're on Windows and you're using Chrome or Firefox or something like that, I will show you in just a moment an equivalent. Well, I'll show you the equivalent on Chrome. I don't know what it is on Firefox, though it might be similar. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the Network tab here, and I'm going to refresh this page like so. And then I'm going to highlight this little bit here. So this bit here where I'm hovering, localhost, that represents the request that I just fired off when I hit return. So I'm going to click on it. And now you can see over here, I've got some data showing up here. What this is basically showing is what information was sent in the request and a little bit of the information that was sent back in the response. Okay, so let's focus first on this request bit here. Okay, so it says get HTTP colon 1.1 and then some accept and a few little things here. Okay. Now for the most part, for right now, most of this is pretty much unimportant to us. The main thing I think I would draw your attention to for right now is this first bit right here, get. So that is one of several verbs that browsers are allowed to convey when they are making a request to a server, okay? And by the way, this verb is part of a computer language called HTTP, which is why when we type out the more formal URL, it's usually http:// blah, 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 www. whatever, right? So the language of the web is a language called HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Again, that's not super important that you memorize or know all of that. It doesn't really matter. But within this language, there are a number of standardized operations that we are able to carry out, okay? So if you think back to chapter 12, where we were doing the database work, and I introduced you to the basic concept of a CRUD application, and I said that CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. These are very common operations that you can do in computing in general, where you're creating records and you're updating records. You can delete records, you can retrieve records, things of that sort. Well, actually, it turns out that in Hypertext Transfer Protocol, there are very similar CRUD-like operations that are defined within the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, okay? And one of those operations is called get, and it is a verb, okay? So when our browser specifies the get operation, it's talking to a server and it's essentially saying, I want to retrieve some data. Okay. Now it could say, I want to send you some data. And that might be with a verb called post. Okay. Like when you fill out a form, like it asks your first name, last name, and things of that sort, and then you hit submit or save or whatever. In that case, your browser is sending a bunch of data that you entered, and it will use not a get, but it will use usually a post, although it could do it in a few different ways. But the most standard thing, I suppose, would be a post, okay? And then there are other verbs as well, but get and post are by far the most common operations that you will see in HTTP, all right? So we're saying get. Now, get what? Well, here, we're not really specifying too much other than just that / there. I don't know if you can see that. I'll try to zoom in. But we're just saying get the very first whatever there is available to get, okay? So how did that / end up becoming this data here for Hello World? So let's jump back over to our application here, and I'll just tell you very briefly. So our application, you can really think of it as two applications in one. Because we built this with the start.spring.io application builder thingy, it kind of gave us two applications. The first application that it gave us, which we won't directly be interacting with, is what you can generally think of as a web server program called Tomcat by default, although we can change that. So Tomcat is a Java-centric web server, and Java-centric web servers are usually referred to more as application containers because they are meant to contain an application. So they themselves are an application which is meant to contain your application, okay? So this program that we've created here contains, sorry to keep using that word, but it contains this program called Tomcat embedded within it. And the embedded version of Tomcat that we have here knows how to open up a port on your computer. And by default, it opens up port 8080, and it will sit there and listen for incoming requests. And if an incoming request happens to be a GET request, and doesn't specify a particular name of a resource, which you can think of as a file, if it doesn't specify a specific resource or file, then by default, Tomcat and most web servers in the world by default will look for a file called index.html. And if there is such a file, they will usually send that file back to the server. So that's why we created this file and named it index.html, because I wanted that to work by default, if you will, okay, so that you wouldn't have to specify. Now, if we had named this file something else, in fact, I will do that real quick. I will call it junk.html, okay? And then I will restart my service here. Okay, so now if I request this, now I get an error, okay? Because I'm still not specifying a specific file or resource that I want. And so Tomcat will look for an index.html file, but there isn't one. And so it has nothing that it can return back. However, now if I explicitly ask for junk.html, I get that, okay? So that gives you a little more insight into what's going on with the web server and Tomcat and all of that. And so Tomcat is working hand in hand with additional code that is provided by the Spring framework. And then the Spring framework, in turn, is waiting for me to write even more additional code to do what I want it to do, okay, in which we haven't done that yet. But this is just basic functionality that we're getting right out of the box. All right, let's also talk a little bit about the language that is used to specify what should be displayed in a web browser. Now, I'm not going to be really explicitly teaching this language. The language, by the way, is HTML, which is Hypertext Markup Language. Hopefully, a lot of you have heard of HTML and have some gist of what it is, at least. You may not know the language explicitly, but you know, yeah, websites and stuff are written using this language called HTML. So we'll take just a very quick peek at a little bit more of what this HTML language is all about. So it is what we refer to as a markup language, and it consists of lots of things like this, which are referred to as tags. And it has a good number of tags that you can use to control how a particular web page might look. So in this case, I did the bare minimum here, but I could have done a little more. So I'll just show you a couple of little things real quick, and we'll learn more and more as we go, but just to give you a little idea. So I just told it to display the word hello world in the body of the page. Okay, so that would be just this main area of the page. There's also like this header, this head section of the page, and this is more like what we call metadata. Okay, so we can specify some various types of metadata and things of this sort, but let's do a little change here. So I'm going to select this hello world, and I'm going to do an Option Command T to surround. So remember now, in our Java code, I could select a block of code or a few lines of code and do an Option Command T, and I could surround that block of code with things like if statements and try-catch blocks and things of that sort. Well, when I'm editing HTML in IntelliJ, I can still use the Option Command T, and I can still use it to surround selections of HTML. But now, of course, it's not going to give me, Java-centric options like surround with an if or a try-catch. Instead, it gives me options that make sense for HTML language, okay? And so I can choose to, for example, surround that text with a tag. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to choose this, and now I get a little cursor waiting right there so that I can create a tag. And I don't know, let's do like a header tag. So I'm going to do an H2 header tag and then hit return. Notice that I got what's called an opening H2 tag here and then a closing H2 tag here. And it's closing because it has a / there, which means that's the end of this tag over here, okay? And then I'm going to restart the server, which is generally pretty quick because I don't really have much going on here. Then I will refresh, And now that's bigger and bolder. Okay, so now we're seeing this hello world being displayed with a secondary level header tag. If you've used Microsoft Word or Apple Pages or something like that, and you're typing up a document, you can choose different heading fonts and things. That's what you're doing here. Okay, so that's how you could, do something like decorate some text differently. And like I said, there are many, many tags. I'm not going to get into all of them right now, but just wanted to show you really briefly here that. Okay, so earlier I was saying that we're making a request, and now you see that we're doing this get request, but now we're specifying an actual file, whereas before we just had the / and nothing, right? So now you can see that we're requesting get /junk.html, okay? And we're going to ignore the rest of this for right now. And then we get back a response. So this response will contain all of this HTML. It's just text. We're really just sending off text documents. We're sending off a request that is a text document, and then we're getting back a response, which is also a text document. Now that document will be prepended with what are called headers. So all these blue things here, these are just headers, which is kind of like metadata that just kind of describes, hey, what language is this going to be in, and how long is it, and things of that sort. And then we will receive the actual body, not of the HTML, but the body of the response itself, okay, which will contain all of the HTML. It's really a fairly simplistic protocol or language, if you will, HTTP, when you really boil it down, okay? So notice now we've got languages within languages though. So our browser is speaking a language called Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, between itself and a server. And it's receiving back a response. And inside of that response is a document written in another language of HTML. And then the browser has to interpret that HTML to display something on the screen. Okay, so I think that's enough explanation for what's going on here. Okay, so now in the next lesson, we will proceed to write some actual Java code that we will then use to render something more dynamic on the screen. Okay, so I will see you in the next one. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this content and you'd like to help me out, there are several ways you could do that. First, you can always click the like and subscribe. That'll help me out a lot. Additionally, another way you can help me out is to check the link in the description below. That'll link you to my website where you can find additional courses. And finally, for those of you who might be interested in starting a new career as a professional software developer, I offer a free PDF guide that will detail exactly how you can get started in this field with no college degree and no prior experience. All you need to do is click on the link in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.